Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Leaders Live celebrating International Women's Day. Happy International Women's Day, everyone. Thank you very, very much for joining us today. We're really excited to have you. If you haven't been to a Leaders Live event before, let me just quickly explain how we tend to run things. So our events, we absolutely love to hear from you, the audience. It's really important to us, and your feedback and your views during the live session really help inform our session as well. So please do feel free to give your thoughts, comments, views on our chat function. Emma and our team is there today taking all of your questions, your thoughts, your comments. We really do welcome that. And we're going to be doing a live chat later on in the session with the panel to answer some of your questions. In addition to that, we also run Mentimeter. So we're going to be running a short poll with you today, and we'd absolutely love you to take part in that. The details will come up on the screen for you to use. Emma's also going to pop those details in the chat as well. We're going to be asking 3 questions for our polling today, and we'd love you to give some views, and we're going to also get the views from our panel based on what you think. So without further ado, today is all about International Women's Day, and the topic is about how we close that gender gap once and for all. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our panel. We've got an amazing panel today. I'm very excited to hear from them. And I'm just going to go through each of them and ask them for just 30 seconds to introduce yourself. So I'm going to start off firstly with Kirsten. Kirsten, off you go.
Yes, hello, good morning. My name is Kirsten Harrison. My title is Director for Sales Controlling and Commercial Coordination, which is a very long title. But what I do is I work for Bosch in the division that is now called the Mobility Division, formerly known as Automotive. And what that encompasses is basically various functions within the order to cash process, meaning order management, logistics, supply chain processes, but also accounts receivables.
Thanks so much, Kirsten. Philippa.
Hi, I'm Philippa Batting. I'm the Managing Director of a company called Buckinghamshire Business First. We support businesses in Buckinghamshire to be the best business that they can be. And I have a team of 60 people.
Thanks so much, Philippa. George.
Morning, happy International Women's Day. I'm George. I'm co-founder and co-CEO of the PR Network. We're a PR and communications agency across 60 countries. I work virtually. We're set up virtually by design, and I co-CEO job share with my business partner, Nikki.
Thanks so much, George. And Tanya.
Good morning, everybody. Happy International Women's Day. I'm Tanya Kumar. I'm a Principal Policy Advisor at the Confederation of British Industry. We are one of the UK's largest business lobbying organisations. I cover infrastructure and energy policy at the CBI, and also in the last year, I have been leading our policy work on COVID response. I am also the co-chair of the CBI's Race and Ethnic Equality Network.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tanya. Thank you, ladies, so much for being with us today. I'm very excited to get all of your different perspectives on this issue. Obviously, International Women's Day this year, we're talking about choose to challenge. And I know we've all had conversations between us about what we're all thinking to choose to challenge this year. And if you've been following us on LinkedIn, you may have seen some of the videos from the panelists around choose to challenge. But if you haven't, I'd like to just go around the panel and just ask you personally, what is it that you're choosing to challenge as a woman working in business today? What is the thing that's kind of really in your heart that you want to choose to challenge this year to move us forward for International Women's Day? Philippa, can I start with you?
For me, it's challenging myself again. I think maybe I've become a little complacent, and am I really taking every opportunity now to call out inequalities, all inequalities, because actually the workplace should be accessible for everybody. And I think, yeah, you can get a bit over familiar. So I challenge myself to be a bit more observant.
Yeah, I think that's a great one, because I think sometimes, you know, we've all perhaps experienced something that's been a challenge or difficult in relation to equality in our time, you know, and if I reflect back on myself, I perhaps always haven't done the best that I could have done in terms of perhaps calling certain things out. And I know we'll probably get onto some of that a little later on. Tanya, how about you in terms of your challenge for this year?
So for me, something that I'm really passionate about and going to continue to step up on is having those uncomfortable conversations, challenging myself to be the one when people aren't represented in the room, to stand up for them. And that's looking at sort of the intersectionality piece with gender as well. So across race, ethnicity, but also LGBTQ. So often, these people aren't represented in the room, and using sort of my position and ability to get into the room in those conversations, making sure that I collectively speak for everybody.
Thank you, Tanya. How about you, George, in terms of your personal challenge?
Yeah, as you know, Helen, I struggled with this, to choose just one.
There's too many.
It's such a broad topic. I think one of the things I'd like to choose to challenge, and I challenge myself on, is to be my authentic self. I think it's really easy to try and be someone different at work. Those who know me as George at work, whether I'm at work or a frazzled mum of 3 at home. And I think you can, COVID has taught us that you can show a bit of your raw self at work, and those kind of female leadership traits of compassion and collaboration, I'd like to see them come to the fore a bit more. And I think perhaps they have during COVID to some degree.
Thanks, George. Kirsten, how about you in terms of your personal challenge?
Yeah, my challenge is, and we already discussed this, but probably a very broad challenge. I would like to challenge the fact that we actually discuss this, specifically things like the gender gap, very much on Women's Day. This is something that should be, as they say, a no-brainer. We should be discussing this. This is the broader bit of diversity in business, all the advantages a business has from just a diverse leadership team, or just generally a diverse management, diverse employees, the diversity of thinking. And I would challenge everybody just to help us discuss this and challenge, if you want, any systemic bias that's still in there about all of this, and just make this a better place to work for everybody.
Thank you. I really appreciate all of your perspectives. There's an element from, I think, all of you where you're looking sort of inside yourself in terms of how you perhaps, get that little bit braver around, whether it's about being your authentic self or about not staying silent and sort of speaking up or challenging yourself in some way. I think that's something that perhaps we as women have found difficult in the past. I know I certainly have. Where do we find that bravery? Where do we find that guts? Because I think sometimes we can feel, many of us might feel, that if we encounter some form of bias, for us to call it out almost, we could get accused of being, prickly or too sensitive and that sort of thing. What advice would you give perhaps to the audience listening in terms of how do we find that within ourselves to speak up? Tanya, I might go to you first, if I may, on that point.
Yeah, definitely. It's a really interesting one, and a lot to unpack there as to, you're not talking about sort of decades, but also cultural impacts as to why we feel so reserved and speaking out for ourselves. I think a big part that we've seen at the CBI, but also amongst the business community, is making sure that everybody is on board. So something that we've really seen, that it's not just the onus on women to own this agenda. Men need to be part of this conversation as well, even to pull, women up the ladder to get into those positions where they can challenge, but also then for women to bring the next generation up that ladder as well. So I think that's something that we have to keep at the forefront of our minds. But that's where the uncomfortable conversations become really important. And actually, as a business, as Kirsten has just mentioned, it actually also needs to be from the top down. We really fundamentally need to change the way that our workplaces operate. This seismic cultural shift, we were trying to do this before the pandemic, and we've got a really palpable sense of opportunity here, where some of these behaviours that we were trying to sort of work around the edges with, we've really been jolted, and we have to acknowledge that we cannot go back to working the way we were before, but we also need to look at the opportunities that come out of this. And one final point for me is just to acknowledge, in terms of, we're talking about businesses here and wider business community. We mustn't forget actually how far we've come in the UK, and that we are, leaps and bounds, away from the rest of our international counterparts. So there's a real opportunity here for the UK to set the agenda on what equality in the workplace looks like. And I'd be really interested as well from the other panelists on their reflection on that, but also from the audience listening in.
Thank you so much for that, Tanya. That's some very good points there. I'm going to, just in a moment, we'll pop up on the screen our first polling question. So just to hear back from the audience, actually, this polling question is all about what do we think are the biggest barriers to equality in the workplace. So it would be great to hear back from the audience. We'll give it a few moments. That will come up on the screen. Audience, if you want to just take your time, go to menti.com. Emma will put the details into the chat function as well. Do feel free to take part in that. We'll come back in a moment and see what you guys are thinking. Georgia, just want to pick up on something that Tanya said. I think specifically around perhaps we need to change some of the norms within our working culture. Yours is a very, very interesting business model. Could you just explain how the PR network operates, and perhaps, how you're perhaps giving some more opportunities specifically to women in terms of the way that you guys work?
Absolutely. So perhaps, it's fair to maybe start at the beginning. So Nikki and I set up a job share, and that's something I'm here to talk about specifically. I don't think there are enough job shares in our industry or in the working world in general. I have no idea why that is, but I can certainly talk to the truth that it has enabled me to work and enhance my career in a way that I wouldn't have been able to, and have children without making the compromises that people do have to make. Our business operates virtually, so we have a core team of 7, and then we have a freelance associate model. So we work with self-employed contractors all over the world in 60 countries who are set their own parameters around how they work, which has enabled them to carry on. They're all 15 to 20 plus years experience, senior consultants who perhaps didn't want to go back into the work environment having children, and that's a story I'm sure all of us can talk to. We all know examples of that, but they're able to set up on their own, work via us, and have control over how they operate. So that could be 3 days a week, it could be certain hours, and they set those parameters, and we work with that and find them really exciting client work they can do without making the compromises they might have had to have made if they'd had to go into the office 5 days a week. So for us, that has enabled us personally, but hopefully, women and men all over the world do things differently that works for them.
I absolutely love that business model. And I think, we'll come on to talk about COVID and how that's kind of shaken up things again, perhaps for women and ways of working. But I really do think that models like yours, George, for the PR network are ones that are going to be really sort of opening up other ways in which how businesses operate sort of as we come out of the pandemic. Philippa, I'd love to hear from you, just in terms of your role within Business First and in Buckinghamshire. You've got a huge number of businesses that you're involved with. And I remember we were speaking, you were saying that there's a large portion of that are female-led. Have you seen a sort of a change in terms of how women businesses are operating? Do they operate slightly different to men? Is there more flexible models, do you think, in that space?
I think women tend to be more empathetic of the different models and the different needs of the workforce. In reality, I became a managing director in 2010 by accident, really. It wasn't part of any great life plan. And I wasn't overly confident about my ability to do the job. And so what I was very sure about was that if I was going to be good at it, I was going to have to achieve through the team, through the people I worked with. And because of that, I set about understanding them as people and what their needs were in order that they did a good job. So that meant that we don't do many events that start at 7 o'clock in the morning, because I have got a high proportion of women in our workforce, and actually it's very challenging for them to get to an event set up for 7 o'clock in the morning. That wasn't that wasn't to say that they're not brilliant at what they do, because they absolutely are, but it was a conscious decision to accommodate a team. But one of the things that happened as a consequence of that was the people that attend our events, they are very, very accessible to women. So we've got that higher proportion of women attendees simply because we are trying to make it easy for all. So I'd like to say it was intentional, but it sort of was a happy consequence of just looking to see what people needed and dropping the need to be perfect and compete with everybody else. We did it our way.
And I think the fact that you sort of consciously made an awareness about actually that if we do it at this time, there's going to be significant barriers to a big proportion of people, you know, not just women, but people that have families and that sort of stuff. And perhaps, you know, being open to kind of just taking that step back and not assuming that everyone can make a 7 a.m. breakfast meeting or indeed a 7 p.m. one. You know, I certainly don't attend networking sessions in the evening because I want to put my kids to bed, and I make no apology for that. That said, I think it's easier for perhaps, you know, myself running my own business, it's easier to do than perhaps when you work for an employer where there is an expectation that that's part of your work. That's when it perhaps becomes a bit of a bigger challenge. I'm just going to.
I was very lucky. I spoke to a gentleman who was the CEO of a huge local authority very early on in my career as an MD. And he told me that he never attended morning meetings because he always had breakfast with the most important person in his life, and that was his wife. Now, did anybody judge him harshly because of that? No. And actually, that gave me license to conduct myself in a different way. Yeah,
it's a great example of leading by example, isn't it? You know, from that leadership point of view. I love that. Thank you. I'm just going to go back to the first polling question, and it's quite interesting actually. So we've been running this exact question on LinkedIn as well, and the feedback that we've had is 30, 30, 30. It was evenly split across LinkedIn. But you guys in the audience today are telling us something slightly different, although we are seeing two issues that are neck and neck. So when we're talking about what the biggest barriers are to equality in the workplace, our audience are saying that 40% of you think that it's still within recruitment and promotion, and then a bias around that. And then the other one, what we've just been speaking about, is inflexible working attitudes. Obviously, some of you still think that gender, the pay gap around, you know, men versus women is still a big problem. But it's interesting that those other two are coming out ahead, which is slightly different to what you've all been telling us on LinkedIn. Obviously, we've just chatted about the inflexible working attitudes. I'd like to just ask around the sort of the bias, I guess, or perhaps the unconscious bias around how do women get into those leadership positions. Kirsten, as a leader within a large global corporate organization, that shift between perhaps, you know, junior level and manager level, how do those women successfully make that shift between manager to senior leader in an organization? Because that's always quite a big leap. And often we find that when a woman is ready to move into that senior leadership position, it also coincides with a very different time in their lives, perhaps where some women choose to have children, and that can always skew things. So it'd be great to hear from you in terms of that, given what our audience is telling us.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely fine. And I just, to pick up on the flexible working, I just do want to make one comment, because I'm always a bit concerned about generalizing this. Flexible working is not a negative thing at all. Completely agree with you. But it's not only a women's thing. It can be for everybody. And we tend to, you know, let's be careful about generalizing. Not all women are mothers. Not all women have children or are going to have children in the future. But if we then move away from the word mother, let's use the word parents. and you directly actually increase the group that you're speaking to. This is a parent's issue, yes, and you might make certain decisions in your life for personal reasons, but you still, this is a parent's issue, not just a women's issue, and that's very important for me. Now, moving back to women moving up in an organization from maybe a junior role to a more senior role, you also get talking to something, you look at quality of opportunity. Are the opportunities there? And are the women there that want to take up these opportunities at that point in time? Where, as you say, if you're talking about maybe the typical age of 30, is that the point of time where women start to think about having a family and maybe stepping back temporarily? Or is that also the point of time where, due to some sort of bias in the organization, they are held back because there's an anticipation, oh, she is going to maybe step back. So there are those two things that are very important. And for me, the issue here is also to discuss this. You need to discuss this. You need to build up a network, a supportive network, be it within your personal, your family, build up a childcare support, but also within the company itself. Get some of that confidence in. No, I can do this. It has been done before, and this is where I think all of us are also setting examples, men and women, in how things can be done. Like Philippa said, also men also choose to be flexible.
Yeah. Melis on the chat actually has said something that is, I think, very pertinent to what you've just said, Kirsten. She asked, how do we have these open discussions more within our management teams at work and within our organizations? Because I think, perhaps not, it's great that I'm sure a lot of organizations are celebrating International Women's Day today, which is wonderful, but we all know that this conversation needs to happen every single day. And how do women in all different parts of an organization, junior to senior, how do they start having those kind of serious conversations with, I guess, those decision makers of the business? Tanya, I'm going to ask you that question, if I may, because obviously you have a wide breadth of understanding across the CBI, and you will have seen this, I guess, firsthand with the organisations you work for. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And just to pick up from what Kirsten said, I completely agree on this point around flexible working, because what we've seen during from the pandemic, flexible working is for everybody. You don't even have to be a parent. And it interweaves into looking at our balance, between work-life balance, mental health. People are carers looking for, for elderly parents, elderly relatives, the pressures that we've seen from people having to self-isolate because of COVID, having that support network. So many of our colleagues are helping at things like vaccination centres, for instance. It's when we're talking about flexibility, it's for everybody. And the benefit is that everybody now has a choice, and they're given an opportunity now to participate in society like never before. And we didn't have that open before. And we've seen this really interesting divide, right, between those people that can and can't work from home, for instance, as well. And that's had a real big impact on our psyche as well. So we have to stop looking at flexible working as it is, just sort of a gendered term. It is for everybody. And therefore, the opportunities become ever reaching like ever before. Just going back to the conversations bit, for us, we are a leader for the business community. We've had to normalize these conversations. So it's part of everyday discussions, sharing, how everybody is feeling, what workload is like, for instance. As George said, it's everybody trying to bring their authentic self to work as well. Now, obviously, that's easier said than done, and we're going through this learning pattern. But it also requires our leaders to be honest with how they are feeling. So for us at the CBI, for those that don't know, we are in, the press and media quite a lot. We're juggling a lot of issues all the time. but the leaders in our organisation, our Director General, our executive team, they just are really open and honest in sort of these ongoing weekly sort of all staff meetings that we now have. We just talk openly and say, gosh, that was, a really tiring period. Giving yourself permission to take time out as well. That's really important from a leadership perspective. It's okay to take care of yourself. So that has been some of the really important ways of working that you have to embed. And we've seen that across British business as well, telling you, it's okay to do these things. It's also about those employer-employee conversations. I think like never before we've seen during this period that the employer has had so much responsibility for the welfare of its people, and businesses have really stepped up to that. And so the challenge now is to make sure, like others have mentioned today, this is not just a one-hit wonder. We're now cementing this.
Thank you, Tanya. And I think that's a great point. And let's just ask the audience actually about specifically COVID, because we know what a massive impact it has had on business anyway. But we as women have also had, I would say, perhaps some highs and some lows that have probably come out of the pandemic. So we've got our next question, which will come up on the screen in a minute. So we're asking you, audience, if you could just take a look and please give us your views as to how you think the pandemic has reshaped the gender divide. For me personally, I think that it has made the ability to work flexibly much more kind of less taboo, which is a great thing. But obviously there have been many women that have, and men, let's be fair, that have struggled, particularly with homeschool. And as I understand it, that the responsibility, or the weight of responsibility of that, has certainly fallen perhaps more on the mum's shoulders rather than the dad. I am definitely one of those. I'm also one of those that happily skipped to school this morning on the school run, sending my children back. But I think it's fair to say that COVID has had some positives and some negatives. George, obviously for you guys running a remote, a virtual organisation, I guess not much change there, but where has the change been, would you say, for you and that sort of style of business sort of coming out of COVID? And what would you like to see, I guess, from COVID that we build on positively?
Yeah, I think it would be wrong to say that we didn't see much change. I think obviously the big difference we had is we had all our children, we're all parents, the PR network, they were all around us. So that was although we're very used to working virtually and we've had the setup, our cultural's built virtually, all of a sudden childcare is not there. So that was a huge issue. And I think, I was reading a report yesterday that said mothers are 3 times more likely than fathers to take on that responsibility. And I think sometimes, particularly if you are part-time, there's an unsaid agreement that if your husband's full-time, then you should take on all the childcare because you're part-time, you're less important. So I think that's something I sometimes worry with. In terms of the positives, I mean, yes, I agree with the poll. I think it may have been worse during the pandemic to have this kind of imbalance, but I think longer term, people will understand, that I think it will lead to, I hope, an era of kindness in business, where people are much more understanding of your personal circumstance, whether you're a parent or not, whether you're on your own. I think people took the opportunity to reach out to their employees a lot more and say, are you okay? And I really hope we'll build on that kind of era of kindness where, good things can happen longer term in terms of how you're offered more flexible work, or that you can work in a different way. You can choose your different hours or your location. And I'm really hopeful for that, because productivity, as probably we all feel it now, in this third lockdown is up there again, but the support isn't.
Thanks, George. Philippa, just perhaps from your perspective, obviously businesses perhaps at a local level, the local shops and local small businesses that are part of your Business First network have probably been some that have suffered the most. Where do you see COVID having a positive impact, out of the pandemic? Obviously there must have been some severe negatives as well, but specifically for women, where do you feel perhaps the changes have come for you at a local level within Buckinghamshire?
So I think COVID will leave us a legacy of making work more accessible to everybody. It's been really interesting watching people accept, children. I remember that interviewer where his child came into the interview. Can you remember? And
Yeah.
we all made such fun of him, and it was awful, and whatever else. And now we've moved to a place where that's perfectly acceptable. And as women in the workplace, we need to give license that that's okay. It's okay for to have other responsibilities other than work. And I think where COVID will take us is that as managers of people, we will learn to be grateful for the outcomes and not to micromanage every minute or hour of the day to seeing somebody shackled to a desk. This isn't about when you do the hours. This is about what you produce. And actually, a lot of this now, I'm not sure that it's intentional anymore, this inequality, but we do have to help people. We need to develop the language where conversations are easy for people to say to us, have you thought about, or could we try, or, can we see if this works? It's less about being confrontational and more about evolving now. I mean, I don't know about anybody else, but I've had conversations with male colleagues where I've actually said to them, are you pulling your weight on the homeschooling? Because it isn't just a woman's job to homeschool. What I would say, though, is our children are little turncoats, because most of them want mum. Dad has offered, I've heard that dad has offered to do the teaching, but actually they want mum, and they run to mum and whatever else. So we're kiboshed at all angles, aren't we? But it's all about keeping it, humour and just trying to do the right thing. But I think there's less and less intentional bias now.
Yeah, thanks for that, Philippa. I'm just going to go back to
on that point, maybe.
Yeah.
Just an example, which I thought was very nice. You mentioned the child coming in on the interview. I've had where I've been in a video conference and speaking to a colleague, and all of a sudden you notice there's a lovely little girl sitting in the background doing her homework. Isn't that nice? And this is a male colleague. Or somebody saying to me, look, I need to finish on time because I promised to take my children to the park. That's great. And I think that in itself has brought us on leaps and bounds in absolutely. I think it's positive.
Yeah, I'm definitely one of those parents who has had their children's head pop up in the background on a number of sessions, not on a live stream, luckily, yet. And they're now at school, so I've got no fear of that today. But, honestly speaking, 2 years ago, that would have utterly horrified me. Absolutely. Now we all just laugh about it, and I don't feel as though I have to close off who I am anymore either. I think we spoke earlier about it, being able to bring your whole self to work. I think, George, you mentioned about this and about that kind of kindness and empathy. We all get it. We all know that we've got, there might be kids at home, or that other people have priorities in their lives. It doesn't mean to say that you're any less ambitious, any less determined, any less good at your job. So I think that change perhaps has been a positive. I also think just having a look at the results from the audience, thank you very much for everyone that's voted. Clearly, audience, you also think that the pandemic has actually had a positive impact on the gender divide, in that it has enabled that breaking down of barriers around work. Tanya, I know you have done loads in this space for CBI in the past sort of 18 months around COVID. Does that surprise you that there's, over half of the audience actually think that this has had a positive impact? And then secondly, I'd ask, how do we capture that? Because we don't want to go backwards now. We want to move forwards, particularly on International Women's Day. How do we capture that sentiment and move forward positively, do you think? Sorry, Tanya, could you just pop yourself off mute, please?
Sorry.
That's all right.
That's another common phrase of the last year and a bit working from home. I think that the poll is really interesting, not surprising as such. And as we've discussed between us as panelists, has it made it worse? Well, an element, yes, because some of those gender stereotypes were reinforced. When we're looking at the impact of COVID on sort of gender divide, a lot of research has come out, and George has alluded to it, that actually the burden disproportionately fell on women. And that's across the whole space and across cultures as well. We saw predominantly, females being seen as the prime carers for families, the prime educational resource as well. But obviously at the same time, there are a lot of opportunities. The barriers have been broken down, and you can see that the difficulty is going to be making sure we capture that now in flexible working policies. So in the last, month or so, we're starting to see a lot of businesses now having changed their working practices going forward. One thing that I would urge everyone to remember is that for large sections of the economy, flexible working is not an option. So if you're working at a manufacturing plant, for instance, producing components for Bosch, you do need to be in there from sort of 9 to X time because of the production cycle. If you work at a supermarket, you do need to be there for those allocated times as well. Alternatively, you might be, in the logistics sector and having to complete a route of goods from A to B, for instance. So when we're talking about flexible working, we need to also broaden it out, and it's enabling, everyone's home and work lives to come together and allowing people to have that permission in the way that they sign up to working for an organization. I think something that we didn't touch on before about recruitment and also progression, right? When you're looking at job descriptions, this has been something really important in the last few years, not only to close the gender pay gap, but the ethnicity pay gap as well. How do you actually, in a job spec, are you offering, the options, as George said, for job share, for part-time? If not, why not as well? Because you're closing off, a whole pool of talent that's available to you. So I think we do have to, move beyond, and having looked at the demand now for flexible working practices, that is one element that's very tangible. Will job specifications now going forward, how will they tailor to this new demand that's out there? But obviously, secondly, let's not forget that actually this is one solution for one part of the economy, but actually there's a large part of the economy where flexible working looks very different, and we need to spend a little bit more time trying to understand what those options will look for them.
I agree, Tanya, and I think it's very easy to talk specifically about office-based work, but actually when you look at something like hairdressing, where they've received none of the VAT cuts that other industries like the hospitality sector have received, and that's 88% women. That's 1% of our workforce, which is 1 in 60 women are hairdressers, and they may be going out of business. So I think there's it's very easy, I suppose, to see the pandemic as a success for working office-based women, but there's so many in retail, hospitality, leisure that it's actually been a huge disaster and set them back. I mean, I think the prediction is 2 million women might be out of work. Certainly in the US, that's something I read yesterday by McKinsey. So it is very hard. You can only enforce the change that you can enforce in your kind of sphere, but to not lose sight of, as you say, the bigger picture that is, quite tragic.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, George, actually. And I think for the hairdressing and beauty sector that, have been so battered by the pandemic, just like the hospitality sector, yet they've been slightly overlooked. Do you think that's a result of unconscious bias at all from government?
So me personally, yes, I do. I think something that is, when I think there was a Mac cartoon that came out during the last lockdown, everyone's like, yeah, I'll be first at the hairdressers. We all want to go to the hairdressers, but they don't get the same level of respect. And I wonder whether that's because it's predominantly family-led businesses run by women with 88% female workforce. Do they have the lobby that they need to have in this country to kind of get the attention they need? I just don't know. Are they as socially media savvy who knows, it's all of these questions. I think sometimes you have to shout really loud, and you need other people who've gone before you to kind of fight your corner. And I think that's, you know, we are, as Tanya said at the beginning, we're making huge inroads. You know, there are, you know, a slight increase this year in terms of women on boards. There's obviously helping the rest of us come through. But if you're the only one, and I think this report I read by McKinsey yesterday talks about the onlys, which often women are the only one in the room, it's very hard to then fight your corner if you're the only person that cares. And I just wonder whether this huge disparate industry like hairdressing is made up of one or few, you know, very small businesses. Can they fight their own corner? I don't know. I definitely feel, I don't know why it hasn't had more media uptake. I feel they've been hugely overlooked, and I feel that is unconscious bias and sexism perhaps at a root.
Thanks, George. Philippa, I guess just what's your thoughts in terms of what George has said on that point? Have you sort of encountered anything within the sector on that from a more regional, local perspective with your businesses?
It's interesting because just when you were talking, George, I was thinking I've heard the same messages from gym owners, personal trainers, barbers. I think actually it is affecting a certain type of business, i.e. that aren't easily branded as tourism and hospitality, you know, the personal services. But there are an awful lot of personal services that now have that are male-run businesses, and they would equally have the same narrative around why didn't we get the 5% and whatever else. So I wonder if it's probably not so much to do with the gender as more to do with overlooking those particular types of businesses and businesses that are in supply chains of tourism and hospitality, you know, that they just didn't think about, you know, they didn't give it as much thought. But we're trying to run a country in a crisis, so there will be some things that get overlooked, and then it's for the rest of us. Our organisation tries to pull all those little voices together, be they male or female, and articulate them to government. And then what we have seen is government moving on certain things. So, yeah.
Thanks, Philippa. Kirsten, I just want to come back to you actually, because we spoke just a moment ago around flexibility, and obviously lots of women office-based work have had that benefit of flexibility. And I think Tanya made the point earlier that obviously not all jobs, not all sectors have that luxury. And I'm thinking specifically for organizations like Bosch, who are, you know, largely you've got big portions of engineering and manufacturing in your work. How do you, I guess, take COVID forward? Obviously not being able to perhaps have the luxury of flexibility. Where should those other areas be, do you think, that we should look to focus in on for those particular sections of the workforce?
You mean the ones that can't work from home and have flexibility? Do you know, this is such a big topic, and I would like to focus this much more on the ability, the opportunities for those people to. There may be something that can be done. You know, there may be something that can be done. Let's look at it. This has really challenged us, and we need the people in the right places of all genders, all ethnicities, of all cultures. We need a diversity of thinking to come up with those solutions. You know, if you're asking me now, come up with something, no. But if you sit together with the right group of people to have this discussion and really tear apart everything, you know, don't just accept because something has been done in a certain way. It has to continue to be done in that way, which our reaction in some cases to this crisis has shown. It is possible. Challenge it. And this is what we're talking about today. Let's have a look at it. Why? You know, people often say that the sky is the limit. Why is the sky the limit? It's not. We've proven it isn't. So, you know, let's sit together. There is, yes, you're always going to have to sit in front of a hairdresser to get your hair cut. Accept that. But let's challenge how it's been done. Let's challenge what can be done. And just, I now go back to my original point. By challenging that and by having the right people in the right places to give you a diversity of thinking, decision making, pull everything apart, make the right decisions. That's how we can respond.
I love that. Thank you, Kirsten. I think that's a great point of which to ask our final question to the audience, which is, what's our audience choosing to challenge this International Women's Day? We've only been able to give you 3 choices, I'm afraid, because I'm sure there are plenty others. And if you have a different one, please pop it in the chat function. We would love to hear what your personal choose to challenge point is. But we've put something in the polling. We've given you 3 options, and we'd love you to choose out of those which one, I guess, resonates with you the most. Is it about bringing more female traits into business? So we talked earlier about empathy, compassion, kindness. Is that going to be the kind of real force for good in terms of rebalancing? Is it about bringing more long-term flexibility? We've just spoken about this as being a major benefit for a big portion of our society, but obviously there will remain certain sections of society that simply won't and can't benefit from flexibility. And lastly, is it about pushing for more female leaders? Do we all have a role here in which to lift one another up a bit more and celebrate female success, but also really push forward and give confidence to one another to go for that promotion, to push within your career and believe that you can move higher? So it'll be great to hear back from you. Please do take some time to take a look at that. We're going to come back to the results of that in a little while. But I would love to perhaps go into some Q&A as well with the audience. So you can put your questions into the chat function, and please let us know what you think. We've got one here from Melias, I think is her name. Sorry if I'm spelling it incorrectly. We all opened up in a positive way due to COVID-19. We're hiding most probably and trying to be professional, not considering our personal life is so important. So we talked a little bit earlier about that freedom to bring, I guess, your whole self to work and not feel as though you have to perhaps hide certain parts of who you are, whether it's a family or whether you've got other sort of requirements on your life that often we know women, around caring roles for other sections of our families, etc., tend to fall more heavily, for example. That ability to perhaps bring your whole self to work. I wonder if I can flip that question around a little bit, because I think what I've heard from the panelists today is it also more of an issue of wider business culture, and therefore that businesses are just not have been structured in such a way that haven't sort of given weight to perhaps the things like being able to bring your whole self to work, bringing those traits of kindness, perhaps that slightly more female edge into a business world? Is it that business culture has just simply been something that has just been heavily male dominated, and is it now our time to perhaps rebalance that from a cultural wide position? Tanya, I don't know what you think to that point.
Yeah, I think it's there's a lot to think about there in terms of, once again, as I mentioned before, having these conversations, but also looking at the importance really of having leadership there behind you. And that goes not only for just female leaders having to open the doors, it rests also on the male leaders. Everybody, the saying goes, every man has been brought up, has had a mother and has that experience as well. So you have to make sure that everybody is part of these discussions. I always love the saying that, diversity is being invited to the party, but inclusion is being asked to dance. That's the other bit that's really important. And I think as someone in the next generation coming up, you also want recognition for what you bring to the table, not just because you are the women in the room as well. I think that's something that's really important. And it goes also today, celebrating International Women's Day. It's not just one day that we should be celebrating one another's achievements. It needs to be every day, and about those contributions that we make. Yes, it is really difficult. And also across sectors, the picture really varies. I was speaking to a friend that works in advertising for the beauty and hair industry, for instance, and that's a very female dominated sector, for instance. And so whilst, they're doing very well on the gender pay gap, actually there is still a lot of stigmas that have to be overcome to be able to perform very well in that sector. Whereas in a different sector, like myself working in infrastructure and energy, actually it's getting women into that sector in the first place that is the issue. And this is where developing the pipeline is so important now. Whilst it's great to obviously have targets for female leaders, for instance, you've got the infamous 30% club that has been doing phenomenal work. You need to make sure that everybody else is coming down the line. Otherwise, everything that you've done in the last, decade or so becomes redundant. And actually, this is where leaders getting up and talking, whether it's taking panels, whether it's making sure that the organisations that they represent are reviewing all of their policies, is enabling them to call others out. And you're seeing that enablement. It's almost, empowerment of those leaders now. They get it. But also the other bit is that their organisations that, the people that they represent, they are watching, and we're also holding them to account. So I think these are a few, tools now in our armoury that's really going to push this forward. And those that don't follow with the diversity and inclusion agenda, they will be left behind. And you're seeing that right now.
I think when you see the financial industry sector take stock as well, looking at the kind of the rise of ESG, so this economic, social and governance piece where people are choosing investment decisions based on ESG. I think that for me signals a new beginning where people are starting to look beyond the balance sheet and actually look at what people's values are within those businesses, and not just from a nice and fluffy and kind of brand perspective, like the kind of the way I work, but actually in hard numbers. And I think that to me shows Tanya, to build on your point, that is the right way, and we are going to look at this the right way going forward. I totally agree with everything you just said.
Thanks, George. Kirsten, do you have a view on that? Because I know we've spoken in the past, particularly around that sort of financial performance.
Of course I do. What you also have to remember, diversity, and again, gender being, including non-binary, ethnic diversity, cultural diversity. I said before, it's the diversity in thinking, but what you have to remember, you're also setting an example. And what in business you have to remember, you have customers and you have associates, you have employees, and we have a war on talent. And you need to retain your current employees, and you want to win future talent into the organization. They can vote with their feet, as they say. Customers vote with their wallets eventually. So if you're seen as a non-inclusive organization, that can only be bad for a reflection in society. There is a clear business case for diversity, and gender is one of the biggest chunks of that. So for me, it frustrates me a little that we're still consistently talking about this when it's such a clear case. But I do think I see things changing. When I asked my two daughters the other day, about a week ago, I said, do you feel like you're restricted by being a woman in your choices that you make in life? They just gave me a very odd look. They had never even thought, which then made me think, goodness, I shouldn't have started this discussion in the first place. But they, at their age, being 13 and 15, don't think about it that way. So that can only be good, but it's up to us to also make that visible, to challenge bias and call it out and make it work. And we can do.
I think that's a great point, Kirsten. I think it's about, ensuring that your two daughters don't encounter those hurdles as they progress into the workplace and as they progress up into their careers. Viv on the chat asks a great question. She says, it feels like now is the time, interestingly enough, with obviously International Women's Day, but now is the time perhaps to open up this question, I think specifically on how has COVID changed our businesses, because it's almost marked a watershed moment, and business has gone through so much change. Is now the time really for women and men within organizations to say, hey, hang on a minute, we need to have this serious conversation now, whether it's around flexibility, whether it's around gender bias. Now is the time for these organizations, through this period of massive flux and change, to start having these conversations more openly. Tanya, what's your experience been? And I'd like to know from Philippa as well, from working with businesses, on the potential of doing that. And if they are doing that, how are they doing that?
Yeah, in terms of sort of keeping the consistency on conversations, I think it's easier said than done. Obviously, this does feel like a watershed moment, but I'm sure if you ask, any of the panelists, you've been across this bridge before, and I've seen the same issue with thinking about ethnicity in the workplace last year with the murder of George Floyd in the US, and how that garnered such a big response around looking at diversity and inclusion in our workplaces. Now, obviously, it's really easy to do something, quickly when that's everything that everyone is talking about. The real challenge, as I mentioned before, is embedding this consistently throughout. So that's where something that we haven't talked about a lot. That's why reporting on your gender pay gap, your ethnicity pay gap, it holds you to account. And accountability is so important. If you want to make a change, then you will first do that exercise. And sometimes you have to stare that data in the face. And then following that, set out an action plan, commit to yourselves as an organization, commit to your people that you're going to take this issue seriously. And automatically then the conversations continue to keep flowing. As George also mentioned, as part of ESG as well, that is really driving businesses as well. And if you're comparing yourselves in a business community, obviously there's a competitive element to this. You will start, falling short of others. And ultimately then the repercussions are, access to talent, for instance, access to customers as well. So there really is sort of a domino effect here. And we're seeing that happen not only here, but globally as well. So that's why it makes it quite exciting.
Thanks, Tanya. Philippa, what advice would you give, I guess, to your businesses that you work with about how to, I guess, continue this conversation within their organizations?
Yeah, I think we're definitely at a fork in the road. I think we could go backwards just as easily as we could go forward, actually, because there will be a raft of employers who've missed the control of having everybody in front of them and everything else. What I would say is that through COVID, long-held conventions and habits have just been chucked out the window by necessity. You couldn't keep doing the things the way you'd always done them, and I would hope that we make a conscious decision to do things better. There is no doubt in my mind that the most effective teams and the most effective organizations are made up of a mixture of skill sets, emotional intelligence, everything. Different is good, and it leads to a much more resilient organization and a much more successful organization. And what we could have going forward is we see that as a sign of success. The differences, celebrate having the differences within your organization and your team. It is not a compliment to have images of yourself everywhere. So I would say, that applies to men should have an International Men's Day, International Women's. We just need to mix it up to a state of our differences are celebrated.
Thanks for that, Philippa. I think that's a super point. We're just going to share back now the last voting in terms of what our audience is looking to choose to challenge. As I say, I know we've only given you 3. I'm sure you've probably got loads more in your mind that you might choose to challenge. But interestingly enough, 41% of you are saying that actually it's about pushing more female leaders across the business world. I guess it's about that point that we touched on earlier about enabling more women into those leadership positions. Again, if you're still the only woman in the room within a board meeting, it still remains a massive challenge. But if you start like with the 30% club in kind of getting more women into those positions, not just one, not just the token one, but more than that, we can really start to pull women up and pull them in through that sort of that leadership journey, if you like. We are almost at time, so thank you so much to everyone. I think massive thank you to the panel for being so generous with your thoughts and your feelings around this. It is a big emotional issue. You know, I'm sure we've all, and everyone listening, you know, have had moments in our careers that have knocked us back around this gender issue. And I think, Kirsten, to your point, you know, we perhaps all grew up as young children, certainly as young girls, believing that we could achieve anything. And you know, as we go through life, we want to make sure that that next generation has no question in their mind that they can absolutely achieve anything they want, regardless of who they are, what their gender is, what their race is, anything, that there is no barrier to what people want to succeed. So thank you ever so much. And thank you very, very much always to the Leaders Live community. I am always impressed and blown away by the intelligent questions and thoughts and comments that you have also shared so generously on the session. We will put this out there on the Leaders Live channel, so if you do want to have a look again or you'd like to share it with friends and colleagues that you think might find this useful and helpful, please do feel free to do so. And I hope it's brought you some value today. So I will just end by wishing everyone a wonderful, happy International Women's Day and wish you a good rest of your week and look forward very much to seeing you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.